The Mafia boss arranged a meeting with his enemy, but froze when he discovered who it was. The winter of 1923 had settled over Chicago like a cold, unforgiving shroud. Snow drifted against the brick facades of the South Side, where the smell of coal smoke mixed with the acrid tang of bootleg liquor and gunpowder. In the heart of this urban labyrinth, Vinny Torino sat behind the mahogany desk of his speakeasy, the Silver Dollar, watching the amber liquid in his glass catch the light from the gas lamps that lined his office walls. At 32, Vinny had carved out a reputation that made grown men cross themselves before speaking his name. His territory stretched from the stockyards to the lake, encompassing a network of speakeasies, gambling dens, and protection rackets that generated more money in a week than most families saw in a lifetime. But tonight, the weight of his empire felt heavier than usual. "Boss," came a voice from the doorway. Tommy Marcelli, his most trusted lieutenant, stood with his cap in his hands, snow still melting on his wool overcoat. "We got word from the docks. The O'Malley crew hit another one of our shipments." Vinny didn't look up from his whiskey. The O'Malleys had been a thorn in his side for months now, a Irish gang that had moved into his territory with the audacity of men who believed themselves untouchable. Their leader, someone the streets called the Ghost, had proven as elusive as his nickname suggested. 3 attempts to eliminate the problem had resulted in 3 dead soldiers, and no closer to identifying the man behind the operation. "How much?" Vinny asked, his voice carrying the controlled menace that had earned him respect and fear in equal measure. 20 cases of the good stuff. Canadian whiskey straight from Windsor." Tommy shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable. "That's the 3rd hit this month, boss." "The boys are starting to talk." The office fell silent except for the distant sound of jazz music drifting up from the speakeasy below. Vinny finally raised his eyes, fixing Tommy with a stare that had made better men confess their sins. "What kind of talk?" "They're saying maybe it's time to negotiate. Find out what this Ghost wants, see if we can come to an understanding." Tommy's words came out in a rush, as if saying them quickly would lessen their impact. Vinny's laugh was as sharp as broken glass. "Negotiate? Tommy, my boy, you know what my father used to tell me about negotiations." He stood, moving to the window that overlooked the snow-covered street below. "He said the only negotiation worth having is the one where the other guy begs for his life before you put a bullet in his head." But even as he spoke the words, Vinny felt the familiar twist of uncertainty in his gut. The Ghost's operation was too clean, too professional. Someone with serious backing and insider knowledge was pulling the strings, the kind of knowledge that suggested betrayal from within his own organization. "Set up a meeting," Vinny said finally, the words surprising even himself. Tommy's eyes widened. "Boss, you heard me. Send word through the usual channels. Tell this Ghost that Vincent Torino wants to discuss terms. Neutral ground, the old warehouse district near the river, tomorrow night, midnight." Vinny returned to his desk, picking up a silver letter opener and testing its edge against his thumb. "But, Tommy, make sure our boys are positioned. I don't trust ghosts, especially ones that seem to know exactly where to hurt us." As Tommy left to carry out his orders, Vinny poured himself another whiskey and settled back into his chair. Outside, the wind howled between the buildings, carrying with it the promise of snow and secrets. He thought about his father, Giuseppe Torino, who had built this empire from nothing but determination and violence. The old man had taught him that in their world, trust was a luxury they couldn't afford, and family was the only thing that mattered. But family, Vinny had learned, could also be the source of the deepest betrayals. The phone rang, its shrill tone cutting through his contemplation. "Torino, Vincent." The voice on the other end was smooth, cultured, with just a hint of an accent that spoke of expensive education and old money. "I hear you're looking for me." Vinny's blood ran cold. He'd never heard the voice before, but somehow, in the depths of his soul, it sounded familiar. "The Ghost, I presume. Among other things, your boy Tommy moved fast. I'm impressed. Most men in your position would have sent more bullets before attempting conversation. Maybe I'm not most men." "No," the voice replied, and Vinny could almost hear the smile in it. "You're definitely not. Midnight tomorrow, then. Come alone, Vincent. We have much to discuss, and some of it is better said without an audience." The line went dead, leaving Vinny staring at the receiver with a growing sense of unease. Something about this felt wrong, like a chess game where he was several moves behind without knowing it. He walked to his safe, spinning the combination with practiced ease, and withdrew a small, silver-framed photograph. The picture showed a family, himself as a young boy, his parents, and his younger sister, Maria, who had been the light of their world until tuberculosis took her when she was 16, or so he had been told. The funeral had been closed casket, and in their world, questions weren't asked when the family patriarch made a decision. But lately, Vinny had been having doubts, small things that didn't add up, inconsistencies in the story he'd been told, and a nagging feeling that his father had been hiding something far more significant than business dealings. As he prepared for what might be the most important meeting of his life, Vincent Torino couldn't shake the feeling that tomorrow night would change everything he thought he knew about loyalty, family, and the price of power in the unforgiving streets of Chicago. The next day dawned gray and bitter, with the kind of cold that seemed to seep through brick and mortar to settle in a man's bones. Vinny had spent the morning making his rounds, visiting his legitimate businesses, collecting from his bookmakers, and ensuring that his network of informants understood that any information about the O'Malley operation would be richly rewarded. By noon, he was back at the Silver Dollar, where the lunch crowd of businessmen and off-duty police officers created a comfortable buzz of conversation and clinking glasses. Prohibition had made strange bedfellows of cops and criminals, and Vinny's establishment served as neutral ground for both sides of the law to conduct their business away from prying eyes. "Mr. Torino?" A young woman's voice cut through his thoughts. She stood beside his table, elegant in a way that suggested money and breeding, wearing a dark blue dress that complemented her auburn hair. "Doreen, might I have a word?" Vinny gestured to the chair across from him, studying her with the practiced eye of a man who had survived by reading people correctly. She was beautiful, but there was something in her green eyes that spoke of intelligence and determination, qualities that could be either assets or threats in his line of work. "Margaret Sullivan," she said, extending a gloved hand. "I represent certain interests that have been affected by your recent difficulties with the O'Malley organization." "And what interests might those be, Miss Sullivan?" She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Let's just say that there are people in this city who depend on the smooth flow of commerce, regardless of whether that commerce happens to be legal or not. The current disruption to your operations has created ripple effects that extend far beyond your immediate concerns." Vinny leaned back in his chair, intrigued despite himself. "You're talking about the kind of people who prefer to remain invisible while others get their hands dirty." "Precisely." Margaret opened her small purse and withdrew a manila envelope, sliding it across the table. "These are photographs taken at various O'Malley operations over the past 2 months. Perhaps you'll find them illuminating." The photographs were professional quality, taken with expensive equipment by someone who knew how to remain unseen. They showed meetings, money exchanges, and faces that Vinny recognized, some from his own organization, but it was the final photograph that made his blood run cold. A young woman, photographed from a distance but clearly visible, stood beside a man Vinny assumed was one of the O'Malley lieutenants. The woman's profile was unmistakable, even after all these years. The same delicate features, the same way of holding her head when she was concentrating, the same gesture of tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "Where did you get this?" Vinny's voice was barely above a whisper. "Does it matter? What matters is that your ghost appears to have a very personal interest in your operations, Mr. Torino. The question is, what are you prepared to do about it?" Before Vinny could respond, Margaret stood, leaving the photographs on the table. "A word of advice. Tonight, when you meet with your enemy, remember that sometimes the people we trust most are the ones with the greatest capacity to destroy us." She disappeared into the crowd, leaving Vinny alone with the photographs and a growing certainty that his world was about to collapse around him. He stared at the image of the young woman, his mind racing through possibilities he didn't want to consider. Maria, his sister, who was supposed to be dead, buried in Graceland Cemetery under a headstone he visited every year on her birthday. But the woman in the photograph was alive, older certainly, but unmistakably the little girl who used to sneak into his room during thunderstorms and beg him to tell her stories about knights and dragons. The afternoon passed in a blur of preparation and painful recollection. Vinny found himself remembering details he had buried, His father's secretive phone calls in the weeks before Maria's supposed death, the closed casket funeral that had seemed strange even then, and his mother's broken-hearted descent into madness that had ended with her own death 2 years later. Had it all been a lie? Had Giuseppe Torino, the man Vinny had idolized and tried to emulate, sacrificed his own daughter for reasons that died with him? As evening approached, Vinny made his final preparations for the meeting. He strapped a .38 to his ankle, slipped a switchblade into his coat pocket, and tucked his father's rosary into his vest. Whatever happened tonight, he would face it as a Torino, with all the pride and pain that name carried. Tommy appeared in his office doorway as the clock struck 11. "The boys are in position, boss. 3 teams with clear sight lines to the warehouse. 1 word from you, and this ghost becomes a real ghost." Vinny nodded, but his heart wasn't in it. "Remember what I told you, Tommy? Nobody moves unless I give the signal. This thing, it's more complicated than we thought." The drive to the warehouse district took 20 minutes through streets that grew progressively darker and more deserted. The old industrial area near the Chicago River had been largely abandoned since the war, leaving behind a maze of empty buildings and rusted machinery that provided perfect cover for the kind of business Vinny conducted. The warehouse he'd chosen sat at the end of a dead-end street, its broken windows like dead eyes staring out at the frozen river. Vinny parked his Packard a block away and walked the rest of the distance, his breath forming white clouds in the frigid air. Inside the warehouse, a single kerosene lamp provided the only light, casting dancing shadows on the brick walls. Vinny checked his watch. 5 minutes to midnight. He was early, which had always been his habit. In his business, punctuality was often the difference between life and death. The sound of footsteps echoed from the darkness beyond the lamp's glow. Slow, measured steps that spoke of confidence rather than fear. Vinny's hand moved instinctively toward the gun under his coat, then froze as a figure stepped into the light. The woman from the photograph stood before him, but seeing her in person was like being struck by lightning. She was older, certainly. The tuberculosis that was supposed to have killed her had been replaced by the sharp intelligence and cold beauty of a woman who had learned to survive in a world that showed no mercy to the weak. "Hello, Vincent," she said, and her voice was exactly as he remembered it, though tempered now with an authority that spoke of hard-won power. "It's been a long time." Vinny felt the world tilt on its axis. Everything he had believed, everything he had built his life around, crumbled in the space of a heartbeat. "Maria," he whispered. "My God, Maria, what have they done to you?" Maria Torino, or whatever name she went by now, stood in the lamplight like a ghost given flesh, beautiful and terrible in equal measure. She wore a long black coat that accentuated her pale skin, and her dark hair was pulled back in a severe style that emphasized the sharp intelligence in her green eyes. This was not the frail, consumptive girl Vinny remembered, but a woman forged in fires he couldn't begin to imagine. "What have they done to me?" Maria's laugh was bitter as winter wind. "The better question, dear brother, is what they told you they had done to me." Vinny's mind reeled, struggling to process what he was seeing. "Papa said, tuberculosis. The doctors said you were dying. We buried you, Maria. I visited your grave. You buried an empty coffin." She began to walk slowly around the warehouse, staying within the circle of lamplight like a predator marking territory. Father made sure of that. "Tell me, Vincent, what do you remember about the weeks before my supposed death?" The memories came flooding back with painful clarity. Giuseppe had been more secretive than usual, taking meetings late at night with men whose faces Vinny never saw. There had been arguments behind closed doors, heated conversations in Italian that stopped abruptly whenever Vinny entered the room. And Maria herself had seemed different. Not sick, but frightened, like a caged animal looking for escape. "The Castellano family," Vinny said slowly, the pieces beginning to fall into place. "Papa was having trouble with them. Their territory was pushing into ours." "Very good. And do you remember what Don Castellano wanted as tribute for allowing Father to maintain his operations?" The truth hit Vinny like a physical blow. In their world, marriages were business arrangements, alliances sealed with blood and sanctified by the church. Giuseppe had refused to consider marrying his 16-year-old daughter to Salvatore Castellano, a man notorious for his cruelty to women. The insult had nearly started a war. "He wanted you," Vinny whispered. "He wanted me." and father knew that saying no would mean the destruction of everything he'd built. But giving me to that monster. Maria's composed mask slipped for a moment, revealing the pain beneath. So he found a third option. Maria Torino died of tuberculosis, but a young woman named Mary O'Malley was born on the same night. O'Malley. The name tasted like ashes in Vinny's mouth. You're the ghost. I prefer to think of myself as a woman who learned to survive in a world that wanted to trade her like cattle. Maria stopped her pacing and faced him directly. Father sent me to Ireland, to distant relatives who agreed to take me in exchange for a substantial payment. I was supposed to disappear, live quietly, never return to Chicago. But you did return. I did, and I brought friends. Her smile was sharp as a knife blade. The Irish taught me many things, Vincent. They taught me about loyalty, about brotherhood, about what it means to fight for something bigger than yourself. They also taught me about revenge. The warehouse fell silent except for the distant sound of wind whistling through broken windows. Vinny felt the weight of his gun against his ribs, but the thought of drawing it seemed absurd. This was his sister, the little girl he had protected from neighborhood bullies, whose tears he had dried after nightmares. Why now? He asked. Why come back after all these years? Because father is dead, and his sins die with him, but his empire. Maria gestured at the darkness beyond the lamplight. His empire lives on, built on the bones of everyone he betrayed, including his own daughter. I didn't know, Vinny said desperately. Maria, you have to believe me. If I had known you were alive, you would have what? Welcomed me back with open arms. Her voice dripped with contempt. You've become everything father wanted you to be, Vincent. Ruthless, feared, successful, the perfect heir to his legacy of blood and betrayal. That's not fair. Fair? Maria laughed again, and this time there was genuine amusement in it. Fair would have been having a choice in my fate. Fair would have been having a brother who asked questions when his sister supposedly died overnight, of a disease she'd never shown symptoms of. Fair would have been having a family who mourned something other than their lost business opportunities. The accusations cut deep because they carried the weight of truth. Vinny had been 18 when Maria died, old enough to ask hard questions but too eager to prove himself worthy of Giuseppe's legacy to look too closely at convenient answers. He had thrown himself into the family business, using his grief as fuel for the ambition that had built his empire. What do you want from me? He asked finally. I want what was stolen from me. I want the Torino name, the respect it commands, the power it wields. I want the empire father built on my supposed corpse. And me. Maria studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. That depends entirely on you, brother. You can fight me, in which case this conversation ends with one of us dead and the other ruling over ashes. Or you can remember that blood is thicker than water, and that the real enemy was never the Irish gang moving into your territory. The real enemy was the system that made a 16-year-old girl disappear rather than stand up to a monster. Vinny felt the world shifting beneath his feet. Everything he had built, everything he had believed about himself and his family, hung in the balance of his next words. Outside, he could hear the distant rumble of cars. His men, growing nervous about the length of the meeting, the legitimate businesses. He said slowly. The protection, the bootlegging operations, the gambling. You want half. I want it all, Maria corrected. But I'm willing to share it with family, under certain conditions, which are, first, Don Castellano dies. He's old now, weak, and his sons are idiots. It would be a mercy killing, Maria. Second, we consolidate the Irish and Italian operations under one organization. No more territorial disputes, no more unnecessary bloodshed between families who should be allies. And third, Maria's smile was cold as Arctic ice. Third, we make sure that what happened to me never happens to another girl in our world. The trafficking, the forced marriages, the treatment of women like property, it ends. We use our influence to change things, one family at a time if necessary. Vinny stared at his sister, seeing for the first time the woman she had become. She was dangerous, certainly, but there was something else there, a vision of what their world could be, if guided by someone who understood both its cruelties and its possibilities. You've thought this through. I've had years to think it through. Years to plan, to build alliances, to position myself for this moment. She stepped closer, and in the lamplight, he could see traces of the girl she had been. The question is whether you're my brother or my enemy. Before Vinny could answer, the warehouse door exploded inward, and Tommy Marcelli burst in with 2 other soldiers, guns drawn and faces grim with determination. "Boss!" Tommy shouted. "We heard voices. Thought you might be in trouble." Time seemed to slow as Vinny saw Maria's hand move toward her coat, saw his men raising their weapons, saw the elaborate dance of violence that had defined his world about to claim the sister he had mourned for years. "Stand down!" he roared, his voice echoing off the warehouse walls. "All of you, stand down!" But he could see in Tommy's eyes that it was too late. The young lieutenant had spent too many years in a world where hesitation meant death, and he was already squeezing the trigger. The gunshot echoed through the warehouse like thunder, followed immediately by the sharp crack of Maria's return fire. Tommy Marcelli spun and fell, his weapon clattering across the concrete floor as he clutched his shoulder. Maria had moved with practiced precision, drawing a small pistol from her coat and firing in one fluid motion that spoke of years of training. "Nobody else moves." Vinny's voice cut through the chaos as he stepped between his sister and his remaining men. "Anyone who fires another shot answers to me personally." The 2 soldiers looked confused, their weapons still drawn but uncertain about their target. They had followed Tommy into what they thought was a rescue mission, only to find their boss protecting the very person they believed to be his enemy. "Boss," one of them said carefully, "You thought wrong." Vinny's tone brooked no argument. "Help Tommy, get him to Doc Martinelli, and spread the word. Nobody, and I mean nobody, makes a move against the O'Malley organization without direct orders from me." As his men helped Tommy to his feet, the wounded lieutenant fixed Vinny with a stare filled with pain and confusion. "Boss, what's going on? Who is she?" Vinny met his eyes steadily. "Family, Tommy. She's family." After the men left, dragging their wounded colleague between them, the warehouse fell silent again except for the sound of wind through broken glass. Maria had reholstered her weapon but remained alert, her posture suggesting she was ready for whatever came next. "Your boys are loyal," she observed. "Loyalty is all we have in this business," Vinny replied. "Without it, we're just criminals with expensive suits. And yet loyalty was what Father demanded when he decided my fate without consulting me. Loyalty was what kept you from asking uncomfortable questions about my convenient death." Maria moved back into the circle of lamplight. "Loyalty can be a prison as well as a virtue, Vincent." He couldn't argue with that. Looking back, he could see how his blind loyalty to Giuseppe had made him complicit in his sister's disappearance. He had been so eager to prove himself worthy of the Torino name that he had never questioned the price others paid for his inheritance. "Tell me about Ireland," he said. "Tell me what happened to you there." Maria's expression softened slightly, and for a moment, she looked almost like the girl he remembered. "The O'Malleys took me in, but they weren't doing it out of charity. Father's payment bought me a place in their organization, not their family. I started as little more than a servant, but I learned quickly that in their world, survival depended on making yourself indispensable." She began walking again, her heels clicking on the concrete. Sean O'Malley, the patriarch, had 3 sons. The youngest, Patrick, was close to my age, and he became protective of me. He taught me to shoot, to fight, to think like a strategist rather than a victim. You loved him. I did. And he loved me, or at least he loved the woman I became under his tutelage. We married when I was 20, and I threw myself into building the O'Malley organization with the same passion Father had shown in creating his empire. What happened to him? Pain flickered across Maria's features. The same thing that happens to most men in our world. He trusted the wrong person, took a risk that didn't pay off. He was gunned down outside a pub in Dublin 3 years ago. I'm sorry. Don't be. Patrick taught me that sentiment is a luxury we can't afford. His death taught me that if I was going to survive, I needed to stop being someone's daughter or someone's wife and start being my own woman. The pieces of her story were falling into place, painting a picture of a woman who had been forged by loss and betrayal into something harder than diamond. But there were still questions that needed answering. Why Chicago? Why risk coming back here? Because this is where it started. Father's betrayal, The system that made my disappearance possible. The world that treats women like commodities to be traded. Maria's voice hardened with resolve. I can build an empire in Ireland, but changing the culture of our thing requires influence where it matters most, in the families that set the tone for how business is conducted. And you think we can change things? I think we're uniquely positioned to try. You have the respect of the Italian families. I have connections with the Irish and Jewish organizations. Together, we could build something different, an alliance based on mutual benefit rather than territorial conquest. It was an ambitious vision, and Vinny could see the appeal of it. The constant warfare between ethnic gangs was wasteful, drawing attention from law enforcement and limiting everyone's earning potential. A unified organization could control prices, eliminate unnecessary competition, and present a united front against outside threats. But there were obstacles that couldn't be ignored. The other bosses won't accept it, he said. They're too set in their ways, too invested in the old grudges. Then we make them an offer they can't refuse, Maria replied with a smile that reminded him uncomfortably of their father. Prosperity for those who join us, extinction for those who oppose us. You're talking about war. I'm talking about evolution. The strong survive, the weak are eliminated. It's the natural order of things. Vinny studied his sister's face in the lamplight, seeing both the girl he had loved and the dangerous woman she had become. Her plan was brilliant in its simplicity, but it would require a level of ruthlessness that made him uncomfortable. Still, the alternative was continuing the current system of endless conflict and missed opportunities. Castellano, he said finally, you really want him dead. I want him erased from the face of the earth, Maria replied without hesitation. That man represents everything that's wrong with our world. The casual cruelty, the treatment of women as property, the belief that power gives him the right to take whatever he wants. Killing him won't change the system. No, but it will send a message. It will show other men like him that their actions have consequences, even if those consequences are delayed by years. Vinny could understand her desire for revenge, even admire it in a twisted way. Don Salvatore Castellano had terrorized the Italian community for decades, growing fat and lazy on tribute extorted through fear. His death would indeed send a message, but it would also trigger a response from his family that could spiral into open warfare. If we do this, he said carefully, we need to be prepared for the consequences. The Castellanos won't take his death lying down. Let them come. By the time they realize what's happening, it will be too late to stop us. The confidence in her voice was both reassuring and terrifying. This was no longer the frightened girl who had been spirited away in the night, but a woman who had learned to play the game at the highest levels. She had resources, allies, and most importantly, the kind of focused determination that had built empires throughout history. I need time to think, Vinny said finally. Of course. But don't take too long, brother. The wheels are already in motion, with or without your participation. The only question is whether you'll be part of the solution or part of the problem. She moved toward the warehouse door, then paused and looked back. There's one more thing you should know, the photographs that woman showed you today. I arranged for her to approach you. I wanted you to have time to process the truth before we met. Margaret Sullivan. Works for me, among others. I've been watching your organization for months, Vincent, learning its strengths and weaknesses. I know about your legitimate businesses, your political connections, your personal habits. I know you visit my grave every year on my birthday, and that you still keep my picture in your office safe. The revelation should have angered him, but instead, Vinny felt a strange sense of relief. At least now he knew where he stood. Tomorrow night, Maria continued, there's a gathering at Castellano's restaurant, his granddaughter's engagement party. Half the Italian leadership in the city will be there, including several men who profited from my disappearance. Maria, think about it, Vincent. One night, one operation, and we eliminate the old guard while establishing the new order. It's an opportunity that won't come again. She disappeared into the darkness beyond the doorway, leaving Vinny alone with his thoughts and the weight of an impossible decision. Outside, he could hear his men starting their cars, preparing to escort him back to the relative safety of his own territory. But as he walked toward the warehouse door, Vincent Torino knew that there was no such thing as safety in his world. There were only choices, and the consequences that followed them into the darkness. The next evening arrived with the kind of crisp clarity that made the lights of Chicago seem to sparkle like diamonds scattered across black velvet. From his office window at the Silver Dollar, Vinny watched the city come alive with the energy of a Saturday night, knowing that somewhere in those glittering streets, his sister was preparing for what could be the most audacious operation in the city's criminal history. He had spent the day in careful preparation, making arrangements that could support either outcome of tonight's events. His will had been updated, his most trusted associates given sealed envelopes to be opened only in the event of his death, and his legitimate businesses placed under the protection of lawyers who specialized in preserving assets during times of transition. Tommy Marcelli sat across from his desk, his wounded arm in a sling but his eyes as sharp as ever. The young lieutenant had earned his position through intelligence as much as loyalty, and Vinny needed both qualities tonight. "Boss," Tommy said quietly, "whatever you're planning, the boys are ready to follow you into hell if necessary." "That might be exactly where we're heading," Vinny replied. "Tommy, what I'm about to tell you doesn't leave this room unless something happens to me." "Understood." "Of course, boss. The woman who shot you last night, she's my sister, Maria Torino, who we buried 7 years ago, except we didn't because she wasn't dead." Tommy's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: disbelief, confusion, and finally a grim understanding of the implications. "The ghost is your sister. The ghost is my sister, and she's planning to eliminate Don Castellano and half his organization tonight at his granddaughter's engagement party." "Jesus Christ." Tommy leaned back in his chair, wincing as the movement pulled at his wounded shoulder. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to help her." The words surprised Vinny even as he said them, but he realized they were true. The decision had been building in his mind all day, crystallizing as he thought about Maria's vision of a unified organization and the alternatives that faced them all. "The way I see it," he continued, "we have 3 choices. We can fight Maria and her people, which means civil war and the destruction of everything we've built. We can ignore what she's planning and let her succeed or fail on her own, which makes us vulnerable to whoever emerges victorious. Or we can join forces and try to build something better than what we have now." Tommy nodded slowly. "And you think working with the Irish is better than fighting them? I think working with family is better than fighting them. Everything else is just business." The phone rang, interrupting their conversation. Vinny answered on the second ring, recognizing the voice immediately. "Good evening, Vincent," Maria said. "I trust you've made your decision." "I have." "We're in." "Excellent. Meet me at the old Biograph Theater in an hour. Come alone, but have your people ready to move on your signal." "Maria, are you certain about this? Once we cross this line, there's no going back." Her laugh was soft but deadly. "Dear brother, I crossed that line the night Father decided I was worth less than his business arrangement with the Castellanos. Tonight is just the settling of accounts." The Biograph Theater had been closed for renovations since the previous spring, its marquee dark and its doors chained shut. But the building's location made it perfect for covert meetings, and Vinny suspected his sister had chosen it for both its practical advantages and its symbolic value, a place where stories played out in darkness for audiences who came to see larger-than-life characters face impossible odds. Maria was waiting in the theater's lobby when he arrived, dressed in black from head to toe like a beautiful harbinger of death. She had several men with her, hard-faced individuals who carried themselves with the professional competence of soldiers rather than street thugs. "Vincent, meet my inner circle," she said, gesturing to the men, Patrick's brothers, Michael and Sean O'Malley. "They've been planning this operation for months." Michael O'Malley stepped forward, a man in his 30s with the kind of scars that spoke of serious violence survived. "Your sister has told us much about you, Mr. Torino. We're honored to have your cooperation." "The honor is mutual," Vinny replied, meaning it. These men had protected his sister when she needed protection, and that earned his respect regardless of their nationality. "The plan is straightforward," Maria continued, unrolling a hand-drawn map of Little Italy on the theater's concession counter. "Castellano's restaurant, La Familia, is here. The engagement party starts at 8, but the real business won't begin until after 9 when the civilians leave." She pointed to various locations marked on the map. "We have 3 teams positioned here, here, and here. The first team handles perimeter security, making sure nobody gets in or out once we begin. The second team enters through the kitchen and secures the staff areas. The third team, you, me, and Michael, goes through the front door as invited guests. Invited guests? Maria smiled. Don Castellano's granddaughter is marrying the son of a family from Boston. The Torino name is respected enough that our presence won't be questioned, especially if we arrive with appropriate gifts and congratulations. And once we're inside, we wait for the signal, a toast to the happy couple at precisely 10:30. When the glasses are raised, we eliminate everyone on this list. She handed him a piece of paper with 12 names written in her precise handwriting. Don Castellano, his 3 sons, his top lieutenants, and the Boston representatives who've been pushing into our territory. Vinny studied the list, recognizing most of the names. These were men who had terrorized the Italian community for years, growing rich on protection money and human misery. Their deaths would send shockwaves through the underworld, but it would also create opportunities for the kind of organization Maria envisioned. The timing has to be perfect, Michael O'Malley added. We have contacts in the police department who will ensure response times are delayed, but we still need to be gone within 15 minutes of the first shot. What about witnesses? There won't be any, Maria said simply. The civilian guests will leave before the business portion of the evening begins. Anyone who remains is part of the organization and therefore complicit in their crimes. The cold calculation in her voice reminded Vinny that his sister had been shaped by forces he could barely imagine. She had learned to survive in a world that showed no mercy to the weak, and she had adapted accordingly. There's one more thing, she continued. After tonight, assuming we succeed, we'll need to move quickly to consolidate power. The other families will be looking for signs of weakness, opportunities to move into the territory we've liberated. I've been thinking about that, Vinny said. We'll need to make it clear that this isn't a takeover but a restructuring. The legitimate businesses continue operating. The protection arrangements remain in place, but under new management that's more reasonable in its demands. Precisely. We're not destroying the system. We're improving it. As they finalized the details of their plan, Vinny found himself studying his sister's face in the dim light filtering through the theater's dusty windows. She had become everything their father had tried to make him: ruthless, strategic, capable of making the hard choices that leadership demanded. But there was something else there, something Giuseppe had never possessed, a vision of what their world could become if guided by principle rather than pure greed. At 9:15, they made their final preparations. Vinny called Tommy with coded instructions to position their people at strategic locations throughout Little Italy. Maria's teams reported their readiness through a series of subtle hand signals that spoke of military training and professional discipline. Are you ready for this? Maria asked as they prepared to leave for the restaurant. I've been ready for 7 years, Vinny replied. I just didn't know it until last night. La Familia was everything Vinny expected from Don Castellano's establishment. Ostentatious, expensive, and designed to intimidate anyone who entered its marble-columned interior. The engagement party was in full swing when they arrived, with well-dressed guests laughing and toasting the happy couple, while a small orchestra played traditional Italian music. Don Salvatore Castellano himself stood near the bar, holding court like the feudal lord he imagined himself to be. At 72, he was still an imposing figure, his silver hair perfectly styled and his custom-tailored suit emphasizing his considerable bulk. But Vinny could see the softness that came with years of easy living, the kind of complacency that made powerful men vulnerable. Vincent Torino! The Don's voice boomed across the restaurant as he spotted them. What an honor to have you join our celebration. Vinny forced a smile as he approached, Maria at his side and Michael trailing behind like a proper bodyguard. Don Castellano, thank you for having us. Please allow me to introduce my associate, Miss O'Malley, and her security consultant. The old man's eyes lingered on Maria with the kind of appreciative leer that made Vinny's skin crawl. Such beauty gracing our humble gathering. Tell me, my dear, are you married? I was, Maria replied smoothly. My husband died in Ireland, a business dispute that ended tragically. Ah, a widow, but young enough to find love again. Yes. Perhaps I could introduce you to some suitable men. That's very kind, Don Castellano. but I'm afraid I'm quite focused on my work these days." As the evening progressed, Vinny watched the civilian guests gradually depart until only the core members of the Castellano organization remained. The atmosphere grew more relaxed as the men loosened their ties and began discussing business openly, confident in their security and their power. At 10:25, Maria caught his eye and nodded almost imperceptibly. Around the restaurant, he could see her people moving into position. A waiter who was actually Sean O'Malley, a musician who had somehow replaced one of the original orchestra members, a cleaning woman who moved with the fluid grace of a professional killer. Don Castellano raised his glass at exactly 10:30, calling for attention as he prepared to toast his granddaughter and her new husband. "Friends, family, honored guests, tonight we celebrate not just the union of two young people, but the continuation of our traditions, our values, our way of life." The words were still echoing off the restaurant's walls when Maria drew her pistol and put 2 bullets into the old man's chest. The sound of gunfire erupted from every corner of the room as her team moved with surgical precision, eliminating their targets before most of the men even realized what was happening. Vinny found himself face to face with Anthony Castellano, the Don's eldest son, who was reaching for something while his father's blood spread across the marble floor. For a moment, time seemed suspended as the 2 men stared at each other across a gulf of violence and inevitability. "This is for Maria," Vinny said quietly, and justice found its voice. The entire reckoning lasted mere minutes. When the thunder stopped, the Castellano organization had been brought to its end in a single, decisive moment. The old empire was finished, and from its ashes, something new could finally begin. "It's done," Maria said, her voice steady despite the carnage around them. "The old order is dead, and the new one begins tonight." As they walked out into the Chicago night, leaving behind the ruins of an empire that had terrorized the city for decades, Vinny felt the weight of what they had accomplished settling on his shoulders. They had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, but they had also opened a door to possibilities that had never existed before. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now we build something better," Maria replied. "Something that honors the best of our traditions while discarding the worst. Something that our children can be proud of, rather than ashamed of." The future stretched before them like an unwritten story, full of promise and peril in equal measure. But for the first time in his life, Vincent Torino felt like he was fighting for something larger than mere survival or profit. He was fighting for redemption, for the chance to transform a legacy of violence into something approaching justice. As they disappeared into the shadows of the city that had made them both, brother and sister walked side by side toward an uncertain but hopeful dawn, knowing that they had changed the course of history with a few moments of decisive action. The Torino name would live on, but it would mean something different now, something worthy of the price they had paid to reclaim it. In the distance, church bells chimed midnight, marking the end of one era and the beginning of another. And in the darkness between the old world and the new, Maria and Vincent Torino began the long work of building an empire that could stand the test of time and conscience alike. The spring of 1924 brought with it a warmth that seemed to thaw more than just the Chicago winter. Vincent Torino stood at the window of his expanded office, watching the bustling activity on the street below, where Italian and Irish workers labored side by side on a construction project that would have been unthinkable just months before. The aftermath of the Castellano massacre had unfolded exactly as Maria had predicted. The remaining crime families had initially circled like vultures, expecting to feast on the power vacuum left by the old Don's death. Instead, they had found themselves facing a unified organization that combined Italian tradition with Irish innovation, backed by resources and strategic thinking that caught them completely off guard. The quarterly reports, "Boss," Tommy Marcelli said, entering the office with a stack of ledgers. His wounded arm had healed completely, but he still carried himself with the careful precision of a man who had learned not to take his position for granted. The relationship between Vinny and his lieutenant had evolved in the months since that night at La Familia. Tommy had initially struggled with the new order, questioning decisions that seemed to prioritize long-term stability over immediate profit. But a series of tests, including his handling of a dispute with a Jewish gambling operation that had tried to muscle into their territory, had proven his adaptability, and earned him a place in the inner circle of the reorganized family. "What's the damage?" Vinny asked, though he already knew the numbers would be good. The consolidation of territories and the elimination of wasteful gang warfare had increased profits across all their operations, up 30% from last quarter, 47% from the same period last year, Tommy reported. The protection arrangements are running smoothly, the speakeasies are pulling in record crowds, and the new shipping arrangements with the Boston and Detroit families are exceeding projections. And the other business, Tommy's expression grew more serious. 3 more families have agreed to the new protocols regarding women and forced marriages. The Morettis tried to push back, but when word got out about what we did to that pig Castellano, he shrugged. They found religion real quick. It had been Maria's idea to make their principles public knowledge rather than keeping them as private policy. The word had spread through the underworld that the Torino-O'Malley alliance would not tolerate the trafficking of women or forced marriages within their sphere of influence. The response had been mixed. Some families genuinely embraced the change, others complied out of fear, and a few had chosen to test their resolve. Those tests had been answered with decisive action. When the Moretti family had attempted to force a 14-year-old girl into marriage with a 60-year-old associate, Maria herself had led the response. The girl was safely relocated to a convent school in Wisconsin, while the men responsible had simply disappeared. The message was clear. The new order had teeth. "Speaking of family business," Tommy continued, "your sister wants to see you. She's downstairs in the private dining room." Vinny found Maria seated at the same table where he had conducted business for years, but the room felt different now. The heavy masculine atmosphere had been softened with touches that spoke of feminine influence without sacrificing authority. Fresh flowers, better lighting, and artwork that celebrated family rather than intimidating visitors. "You look well, brother," Maria said, rising to embrace him. She had traded her severe black wardrobe for clothing that was elegant but approachable, though Vinny knew she still carried at least 2 weapons at all times. "I feel better than I have in years," he admitted. "The numbers Tommy showed me are remarkable, but it's more than that. I wake up in the morning feeling like we're building something instead of just taking from others. That was always the goal." Maria poured 2 glasses of wine from a bottle that bore no label, their own private stock, imported from Sicily through channels that bypassed both the law and traditional family hierarchies. "But there's something else we need to discuss, something that's been weighing on my mind." She reached into her purse and withdrew a small, wrapped package. "I visited Father's grave yesterday, for the first time since I returned to Chicago." Vinny studied her face, seeing traces of the pain that still lived beneath her composed exterior. "How did that feel?" "Complicated." She unwrapped the package, revealing Giuseppe's rosary, the same one Vinny had carried into the warehouse that night 6 months ago. "I found myself standing there, thinking about everything he did, everything he took from us, but also thinking about what he gave us, the skills we needed to survive in this world, the understanding that family comes first, even when it costs us everything else." Maria held up the rosary, its silver beads catching the afternoon light. "I think he would be proud of what we've built, even if he might not understand all of our methods. He might also roll over in his grave knowing his daughter runs half the operation." Maria's laugh was genuine, carrying none of the bitter edge that had characterized it in the early days of their reunion. "Perhaps, but I like to think that deep down, he always knew I was stronger than he gave me credit for." A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Sean O'Malley entered, his expression serious but not alarmed. "Boss, we've got a situation that needs your attention. Both of you." The situation turned out to be an opportunity rather than a crisis. Representatives from the Detroit and Cleveland families had arrived requesting a meeting to discuss expanding their alliance model to other cities. The success of the Chicago operation had attracted attention from progressive elements within the national crime syndicate, men who saw the benefits of cooperation over constant warfare. "They're offering us territory in 3 new cities," Sean explained as they gathered in the main conference room. "Detroit, Cleveland, and Milwaukee. Full partnerships, with local families maintaining day-to-day operations while we provide strategic oversight and conflict resolution." "What's the catch?" Vinny asked. "They want guarantees that we can replicate what we've done here, proof that our model works beyond Chicago's specific circumstances." Maria leaned back in her chair. considering the implications. Expansion had always been part of their long-term plan, but moving too quickly could strain their resources and invite retaliation from more traditional families who saw their success as a threat to established order. "What do you think?" she asked Vinny. "I think we're not ready yet. We've built something good here, but it's still fragile. We need another year to solidify our foundations before we start trying to export our model." "Agreed." Maria turned to Sean. "Tell them we appreciate the offer, but we're focused on perfecting our operations here first. However, we're open to providing consultation services for families that want to implement similar reforms in their own territories." As the meeting concluded, and the various participants dispersed to their evening duties, Vinny found himself alone with his sister in the quiet restaurant below their offices. The dinner crowd was beginning to arrive, legitimate customers now, drawn by excellent food, and the knowledge that the Silver Dollar was one of the safest establishments in the city. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Father had made a different choice that night?" Maria asked as they watched the bustling activity. "Every day," Vinny admitted. "But I've learned that wondering about the past is less important than building the future." Wise words. Maria stood, smoothing her dress and checking the small watch pinned to her jacket. "I have a meeting with the Women's Auxiliary Committee at St. Mary's. We're organizing a fund to help families affected by gang violence. Widows, orphans, people caught in the crossfire of our wars." It was another of Maria's innovations, a way of giving back to the community while also building legitimate political connections. The fund was supported by contributions from all the families under their protection, creating a visible demonstration that the new order cared about more than just profit. "Before you go," Vinny said, reaching into his jacket pocket, "I have something for you." He handed her a small, leather-bound book, a journal, with M. Torino, embossed in gold letters on the cover. "For recording our real history," he explained, "not the version the newspapers print, or the stories we tell to intimidate our enemies. The truth about what we're trying to build and why it matters." Maria's eyes filled with tears, the first time he had seen her cry since their reunion. "Thank you, Vincent, for believing in me, for trusting me, for helping me turn our father's betrayal into something meaningful. Thank you for coming home," he replied. "For reminding me that power without purpose is just another form of slavery." As evening settled over Chicago, the Torino siblings parted ways to attend to their respective duties. But for the first time in their adult lives, they did so knowing that they were building something that could outlast them both, a legacy based on strength and principle rather than fear and greed. Outside, the city hummed with the energy of a place where old grudges were giving way to new possibilities. In the streets where violence had once ruled supreme, families of different backgrounds were learning to coexist and prosper together. And in the heart of it all, two people who had been separated by lies and reunited by truth continued the difficult but rewarding work of transforming a criminal empire into something approaching justice. The story that had begun with betrayal and loss had become one of redemption and hope. And though the future would undoubtedly bring new challenges and hard choices, Maria and Vincent Torino faced it together, armed with the knowledge that some bonds are stronger than death, and that even the most broken families can find their way back to each other if they have the courage to confront the truth. In the distance, the church bells of St. Mary's began to ring, calling the faithful to evening prayers. But in the world below, in the speakeasies and social clubs where the real business of Chicago was conducted, a different kind of faith was being practiced. Faith in the possibility that power could be used to protect rather than exploit, and that even in the darkest corners of society, light could find a way to shine.